Okay, so in one sentence, my solution to the refugee crisis in Europe was to convince the leaders and politicians of European nations and the Western world to stop spending money on accepting refugees into their countries and instead invest that money into establishing a refugee nation that is permanent somewhere in the world where any refugee can seek sanctuary without discrimination. Now, this idea has already been advocated by at least two billionaires ready to provide hard cash. I further suggested somewhere in Egypt as the optimal location for this refugee nation because it is close to Syria, doesn't require a Mediterranean Sea to be crossed, and it is also close to sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East where most of the refugees are coming from today. Egypt furthermore has numerous cities with buildings and apartments that are largely empty because they were built in areas where no Egyptian wanted to live. According to David Sim's book, Egypt's Desert Dreams, on page 143, we see that the target population of these cities was 20 million. The book also provides detailed maps of where exactly the cities are located, also what they look like, and aerial photos. And according to Financial Times reporting, about 75% of these buildings are empty. So roughly speaking, 75% of 20 million means that these cities with infrastructure could support potentially 15 million people in a situation now where Syria has about 4 million refugees. So it could work, potentially, especially with more money coming in year after year from Europe and the rest of the world. More buildings and infrastructure could be built, hospitals, schools, universities, and so on. The major criticism I got on this idea were the following points. Why would Egypt allow potentially millions of refugees into its country? Well, this is a misunderstanding. This refugee nation, that's called New Syria, would entail land that was bought from the Egyptian government. It would later function as a completely separate nation with its own controlled borders, its own government, its own flag, and its own capital. The border to Egypt would be closely guarded, and no citizen from New Syria would be allowed to cross into Egypt without permission, just like with any other neighboring nations to Egypt. Point number two, how would you even maintain common order in such a nation of only refugees, and who would pay for this? Well, the easiest answer to this question would be, let's use the United Nations peacekeeping forces. I mean, that's what they are trained to do, to keep the peace. And furthermore, Europe and the Western world would provide money year after year until the new Syria economy is capable to generate enough money to sustain itself and even train their own security, police, and military forces. Point number three, how would Egypt be convinced? Basically, the answer is money, improved worldwide reputation, and other so-called sweeteners. That is what the EU offered Turkey to establish a refugee safe zone for Syrians in Turkey. Turkey was offered 3 billion euros, reopened EU membership talks, potentially visa-free travel for Turks in the EU, and a postponement of a European Commission report on Turkey's clampdown on freedom of speech and assembly. Buying land is of course possible and legal, but turning it into a nation, that is a different question, yes. And if Egypt were presented with, let's say, $1 trillion US, a Nobel Peace Prize for their president El-Sisi, and other lucrative trade deals, then maybe they would say yes. It's a win-win for Egypt, right? As Europe would be paying for essentially empty cities in the desert, and they could be put to tremendously good use in establishing New Syria. But this is, of course, the most difficult issue, and we cannot know unless we ask. So let us somehow ask the Egyptian government what they think about this idea. But again, Egypt was just one idea. There are many more empty cities in the world, even in Africa, such as Kilamba in Angola and Yamoussoukro in the Ivory Coast, and numerous other examples, even in China and Mongolia. Point number four, the people coming to Europe are not Syrian refugees, but economic migrants. So this is an overstatement, but it's also a known fact and problem. Germany has actually started sending back those people arriving if they are coming from safe countries like the Western Balkans in Europe. And according to Eurostat, which provides the European Union with statistics, only 21% of the 210,000 people that came to Europe in the second quarter of 2015 were actually refugees from Syria. So only 21% of the people that are coming are actually Syrian refugees, But we should keep in mind that the rest of the people coming are coming from other nations that are also at war, like Afghanistan and Iraq, so they are also technically refugees. But even if all of this is true, then my solution still holds water. If Europe categorically says, no, you cannot stay in Europe, to all the refugees and all the migrants arriving, but then also say, but we can resettle you in New Syria, our nation built for refugees, then this would solve the problem of the excessive amounts of refugees arriving in Europe and also the amounts of economic migrants arriving. You see, the refugees would be saved and could be placed in New Syria, while the economic migrants could also be offered to go to New Syria if they wanted, but they probably wouldn't. And they also wouldn't be allowed to settle in Europe, so problem solved. Point number 5. How would the government work in such a country of random refugees? Again, substantial work on a potential refugee nation has been done by people smarter and more successful than me. Check out refugenation.org about the project of billionaire Jason Busey on the very question of government in a refugee nation. Although it is very brief, we should keep in mind that successful refugee nations have been established already, Israel being the best example, this despite 7 major wars and numerous conflicts. Obviously, if despite such hardships, Israel was still established, then a peacefully conceived nation should be possible. The success of Israel seems to have depended on the very cohesive kibbutzim culture of collective living and sharing, so a great deal can be learned from this socialistic system. However, many kibbutzniks were already present in the area where Israel was later established, so the situation is unique. As a start, New Syria could be run essentially like the refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey, where most refugees are now. My point is that largely empty houses and infrastructure exists already, and that the United Nations are experienced in maintaining order for millions of people. A peaceful transition of power to a locally elected parliament seems to be the natural course, not without difficulties but arguably possible, with the United Nations cooperation and a lot of money from rich countries that don't want to accept refugees. My counter-argument to all these arguments is, there's no other option. With 60 million refugees worldwide and increasing, personally, I have heard of no better solution.